Welcome to another episode of the J&M Backyard Orchard channel. Today's video is about harvesting our Worm Café and renewing its bedding. Our Worm Café has been operating for about 4 months since the last harvest. As mentioned in our previous video, feeding our Worm Café, we purchased a 3-tiered tumbleweed Worm Café from Bunnings, our local hardware store, over 3 years ago. For those who haven't watched that video, you'll find a link in the description below and at the end of this video. The cafe comes with a lid, 3 large working trays, and 1 collector tray at the bottom. Out of the 3 trays, the top tray is our feeding tray, where we feed our worms each week. Most of the worms in the cafe will be found in this tray. We consider the middle tray our intermediate tray, which will still contain some food and worms. The bottom tray is the harvest tray, where you expect to find only castings and little or no worms. We use this tray as our collector or harvest tray. Our collector tray is usually largely empty, with some residue. We typically feed the worms every Saturday morning. On harvest day, we hold off on feeding and conduct the harvest first. It's been a week since the last feed, so we expect that the food we provided the previous week has been mostly consumed. We start by preparing the new bedding. For this we use about 1/3 of a coir peat brick, which is readily available from Bunnings. We soak it in half a bucket of water for about 30 minutes until the brick turns mushy into a soil-like consistency, as you can see in this video. Now we remove the 2 top trays, the feeding and the intermediate trays, and set them aside. This gives us access to the harvest tray, which we remove. We scoop the castings into a separating tray and manually spread them while checking for any worms. If we find any, we put them back into the feeding tray. These are the castings we typically collect. You can see how beautiful and rich they are. In this case, we noticed a few worms still foraging in this tray, not having moved up to the intermediate or feeding tray. We also remove any bits of glossy fruit labels that may have been mixed in during the feeding process and look for any other undesirables. We continue this process until the harvest tray has been emptied. This is our 10-liter storage bucket for the castings. We use our first ballerine worms 10-liter bucket of castings that we purchased before we had the cafe. Each tumbleweed tray, when emptied, provides enough castings to fill this 10-liter ballerine bucket, making it a convenient storage container for our castings. Next, we wash and clean the emptied harvest tray, usually over one of our raised garden beds, to avoid wasting the remnants of the castings and fertilize the bed at the same time. Back at the Worm Café, the collector tray usually contains only some worm casting residues. It is now time to clean this tray by hosing it down and collecting the runoff in a pail, which we would use as a fertilizing tea. Now we reconfigure the Worm Café using what was the intermediate tray as the new harvest tray. Next, we focus our attention on the feeding tray by preparing to remove about half the bedding and worms and relocating them into the emptied and clean harvest tray, turning that tray into the new feeding tray. About half the bedding from the previous feeding tray will also be transferred to the new feeding tray. We start filling the new feeding tray with the mushy coir, squeezing out as much water as possible so it's not too wet. This provides a good base for the new feeding tray. When filled, this tray becomes the new feeding tray. The previous feeding tray becomes the new intermediate tray, and the previous intermediate tray becomes the new harvest tray for the next cycle. So that's how we harvest the castings and renew their bedding. Now we'll feed the worms with fresh food for the next week. The worms from the intermediate tray will gradually move up to the feeding tray once they have consumed the food in the intermediate tray. From here, the process is similar to what we demonstrated in the Feeding the Worm Café video. After covering the new feeding tray with a bit of bedding, we'll sprinkle some homemade compost and use shredded newspaper as the new blanket, finishing it off with a piece of cardboard. And that's it, harvest completed. We'll throw out the old bedding and put the cafe's lid back on. That's how we refresh the Worm Café and extract the castings. If you have any comments or tips, feel free to share them in the comment section below. Thanks for watching.